we are. Okay, Nikki.
All right. Good evening, and thank you so much for showing up and paying attention. That's one of my mottos for living. Show up, pay attention, tell the truth, and don't be too attached to the outcome. My name is Nikki Wright. I'm Executive Director of Sea Change Marine Conservation Society, and it's wonderful to be able to discuss how things are unfolding with Roberts Bay and keep you abreast of the latest hot off the press funding announcements, which aren't plentiful at the moment, but we're hopeful. I would like to acknowledge that we are speaking and working and playing and enjoying the territories of the Westanic people. And I am based in Brentwood Bay, right next to the Sartlet Preserve. We thought how we would do this is just introduce the presenters very briefly. So I can just start by saying Sea Change started in 1998, and we did our first eelgrass transplant in 2000 in Sneakwith, otherwise known as Todd Inlet. And from there, we have been replanting eelgrass in the Salish Sea in various large regions. And we're very concerned with nearshore conservation, primarily because it's the intersection between land and water and between people and estuaries and bays in the ocean. So I love the work, and yeah, and we work very closely with Peninsula Stream Society, Ian, Bruce, and Kyle, and others of the new staff. And so I'm going to hand it over to Kyle to introduce Peninsula Streams, which I think you probably all know.
Thanks, Nikki. And one thing I forgot to mention is please hold your questions until the Q&A. At what point we'll go and answer all of your questions that you may have. But just in the interest of kind of getting through the night, we'll just hold on to those. My name's Kyle. I'm the restoration coordinator for Peninsula Stream Society. I've been with the organization for about a year. I have a master's in science and ecological restoration from the Rivers Institute from BCIT and SFU, and I've done some work in different estuaries up and down the coast, as well as freshwater systems. So happy to be here, happy to be working in Wasanic and Lekwungen territories, and with all of you. And I appreciate your interest in tonight. Maybe I'll pass the ball over to Sarah Cook.
Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Cook. I'm the general manager and senior biologist at a small local consulting company called Coastal and Ocean Resources. And we have been engaged by Sea Change Marine Conservation Society and Peninsula Stream Society to do a little bit of a study on the current conditions and maybe looking at historic change over time in Roberts Bay. I live in North Saanich, so I am currently talking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Sakem First Nation. And this is Obi-Wan. This is my kitten. He is very much wanting to get involved in the meeting. So if you see occasional little flashes of him, he's involved in the meeting too tonight. It's a pleasure to meet you all.
And I guess, oh, Jocelyn, sorry, you're muted.
Okay, I just wanted to say welcome everybody on behalf of Roberts Bay residents. We were trying to figure out before we started exactly where the idea for this study and Roberts Bay restoration efforts started. And I don't remember exactly. I remember talking with Ian Bruce on the beach and talking about residents' concerns about Roberts Bay. And today is exactly 1 year. It was February 9th, 2021, that Ian asked me if Roberts Bay Resident Steering Committee would do a letter of support for a funding application for this research in Roberts Bay. And so the steering committee, which is 5 people, and those who are here are Curtis, Thierry, Mary Chu, and myself. Patricia's unable to join us tonight. But it's so consistent with the vision of Roberts Bay residents, which is to build a future in which our community lives in harmony with the living wonders of Roberts Bay, and where the natural beauty and functionality of the ecosystems of the bay are preserved and enhanced to ensure that this very special place remains a safe refuge for wildlife and a source of inspiration for its present and future residents and visitors. So understanding this, these ecosystems is a really first essential step in preserving and enhancing them. So this study by Corey was right on in terms of helping us and hopefully our community move ahead with that vision to preserve the wonders of Roberts Bay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jocelyn. Nikki, perhaps you'd like to give an overview on kind of the meeting structure, what we're go over, and introduce Sarah.
Sure. So it looks like we can be relatively informal. We're thinking 8 o'clock as our time to end. But what we thought we'd do is have an overview of the Coastal Oceans and Resources, Inc. report. And that report was sent out with some revisions just recently by Jocelyn, as well as a 1-page summary. So Sarah will be reviewing that. And then Kyle and myself will be talking about funding proposals that have been successful and ones that we are submitting. And we can talk briefly about what those proposals look like as far as objectives. And we thought we'd check in with a question and answer period and a discussion with Sarah to just review the reports. And then we'd like to ask you, how would you like to hear from us, in what format? Would you like to do Zoom? Would you like to do site visits? Would you like to do in-person meetings if it's allowed after February 15th? How would you like to communicate with these project partners? And then we'll talk a little bit more about fundraising and more of a question and answer period, and hopefully be done by 8 p.m. So there you go. So if there aren't any comments or questions about how we're going to go through our information tonight, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah so that she can talk about the report and answer any questions.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Nikki. So Coastal Oceans got involved after a discussion with Nikki and Ian down on Roberts Bay Beach one day about whether or not we could give them an overview of, what the current conditions were in Roberts Bay. And part of that was sort of spurred by some observations that have been made that perhaps the estuary at Mermaid Creek, which is of course at the southern end of the beach, had been perhaps eroding. So we went out there and took a look, and from that, Coastal Oceans sort of put together a bit of a plan to try and look at the broad range of conditions on the beach sort of currently, and where possible to look at any historic changes that have occurred. That can be challenging to do. So we kind of ended up focusing down in terms of the changes over time on the actual salt marsh itself, because we were able to find some historic imagery that was actually allow us to sort of more readily map those changes over time and really sort of quantify those changes in a different way. At the same time, so there were sort of 5 different parts to this particular report, and all of that was meant to help inform any decision making regarding restoration efforts in the bay. It did not lay out any kind of plan for doing that or any kind of roadmap, but more just really looking at current conditions and sort of what the bay is looking like today compared to maybe how it looked in the past. So we actually went out on the ground during the May 2021 low tide window. It was an absolutely beautiful day. It was so nice to get out of the office. We were also relieved. Actually got the entire team out there from the office because none of us had been out of the office for at least a year at that point. So we all wanted to get out there, and it was so nice to just see each other without masks on. So it was, we got out there and we did 6 transects. So we spaced them out evenly along the bay. And we basically ran them from the high water line to the water. And we went along and assessed physical characteristics. So what kind of sediment there was, what kind of texture it was, and what kind of biological community there was. Was there salt marsh? Was there barnacle? Was there rockweed? There's obviously not a huge amount of place for physical attachment of biota in the bay. Sorry, cat is trying to attack my lamp. All right, there we go. Sorry. As I mentioned, he loves to be involved in meetings. So we were basically trying to figure out what the current condition of that biological community was. We also got a drone survey done during that same low tide window, the same day while we were out there. And then we just hired a local company who worked with Transport Canada, of course, to make sure it had all the appropriate permits, given that it is in the exclusion zone for YYJ. And basically he was taking some overview imagery of the beach. And we actually had some imagery that had been taken previously by our company in 2004 on what we call one of our shore zone surveys. And shore zone is an aerial imaging and habitat mapping protocol. And so it had been taken from a helicopter at 300 feet. And so we wanted to get some drone imagery at 300 feet again, so we could potentially compare to that shore zone imagery that was taken. And also just to give a broad overview, because, with the transect, you're getting very much what's happening along that corridor of the beach. But if you want to be able to generalize that to the larger bay, it's good to have a more complete picture. And the drone imagery is a fairly cheap and easy way to do that, especially in such a small area. We also started some community engagement through the Roberts Bay Residents Association and the Friends of Shoal Harbour to ask people to submit any historic photos of the beach and to give us their observations of how that beach has changed over time, how the community may have changed over time. And then we also went through and sourced historic ortho photos and satellite images where we could find them. And we actually figured out a way to georeference those by using sort of landmarks in the imagery. So in each of the ortho photos and the satellite images, we were able to identify the same 4 points, and we had GPS points for those. And in that way, we're actually able to make the images work together and be at the same scale and be in the right place. And in each of those images, we identified and drew a polygon around the salt marsh at Mermaid Creek, and those went from 1964 right up to 2021. And then the last thing we did with Sea Change and Peninsula Streams was to head out on a survey of the limits and distribution of the eelgrass bed offshore in Roberts Bay. So what we found overall in the report was that, no surprise to anyone, Roberts Bay is dominated by a sand and fine tidal flat in the lower intertidal, but there is this sand and gravel beach face hugging the shoreline with occasional intruding rock platforms and occasional rock sort of ramps. There was also a couple of, there's a delta spreading down the beach from the outlet of Mermaid Creek, and what appeared to be a relic delta at the beach access off Ardwell Avenue. I wasn't able to figure out if that had previously been a larger stream mouth, but I rather suspect, given the way that the sediment was mounted up there and what appeared to be a delta, that there was one there as well. So it just gave us an idea of the distribution of the sediment. We did notice that there was a bit more fine sediment towards the north end of the beach. It was a bit muddier in the lower tidal flat, and I quantified that by the fact that I almost lost my boot down that end. I was kept trying to edge out further and further to see the eelgrass bed, and because it's a bit patchy down that end of the beach, and I kept edging out further. I was like, no, I can get to it, and then my boot went in almost to the top, and I'm like, nope, not worth it. So I had to turn around and get my way back out. We also noticed that sort of part of the mapping that we did, and we used the drone imagery for this, and then the shore zone imagery, was to look at the backshore, and noting that it had been modified through residential development. Of course, there are a number of seawalls that were built to prevent erosion, and several docks, houses, and other structures that extended into the intertidal. And those are all things, of course, that need to be taken into account when doing any planning for the future. It was really neat getting to talk to all the residents and the people who came out to meet us while we were down on the beach, and just, you know, email communications afterward. It was just really great to have that engagement and be able to hear from people who'd been living on the bay for decades, and, you know, sort of hear from what they were telling us. And some of the neat changes that were noted was the loss of the mud shrimp community. Apparently there used to be a rather large Eupogibia pugitensis, which is the species of mud shrimp that tends to live in this area. Apparently there used to be quite a large one out there. There was no evidence of it when we were out there. And apparently there was a parasitic, I think it was a parasitic amphipod, that had been, it's known to be up and down the coast. Apparently it's been killing off the mud shrimp community in a couple of different places. So it was really interesting to see some of the photos that people had and those observations that had been lost, and that could definitely be affecting sediment texture in some places, because mud shrimps are ecosystem engineers. So they do distinctly change the character of the sediment on beaches where they exist. So the loss of that community could definitely, I did try and source papers to try and figure out what kind of impact that might have on the beach. It doesn't seem to have been well studied at this point, at least, especially not if the loss is more recent. So I'm going to sort of continue to try and figure that out. People had noted that the upper edge of the eelgrass bed had been gradually moving deeper. They were saying that they were having to walk further down the beach to see the eelgrass, and that at the low tides, they weren't seeing it coming up as high onto the flat. Indeed, we know as we were out there at one of the lowest tides of the year, and the eelgrass bed actually wasn't really up in the intertidal. It was still subtidal for almost the whole time we were out there, which was interesting. There was a lot of green algae on the flats. People had noted that the salt marsh had been shrinking at Mermaid Creek, something we were able to quantify a bit more with the imagery, and that there had been some long-term changes in sediment distribution and texture across the bay. Mostly people had indicated that they felt that it was coarsening a bit, that maybe there was some loss of some of the fine sediments from some areas. It's possible it was redepositing in other parts of the beach. But it was just noticing that the distribution and texture, which is not necessarily to be unexpected in a beach like Roberts Bay. It is a dynamic ecosystem, and it's so how that might have affected the bay overall is still something that we would hopefully want to study more of in the future. We actually had really good success with looking at the ortho photos and the satellite imagery, actually more than I was expecting in a lot of ways. I was hoping it would be a good way to identify the salt marsh and how much it had changed, but we were actually able to identify it fairly readily from the imagery, even the black and white imagery, because the texture of the salt marsh was quite distinct from the surrounding area. And we noticed that it had shrunk by about 59% in the last 57 years. But most of that had happened since 2005. And I think that the marsh had changed a good bit over that time. And what seemed to be happening is that up until about 2005, the marsh was actually retreating up the beach. So it had retreated up the beach about 21 meters. And at that point, it kind of hit the terrestrial vegetation in 2005, the upper edge did. And so the front had been eroding all that time. But then what happened is it had nowhere left to retreat to, is what it appeared to be from the imagery in 2005. So we're thinking that it's experiencing that coastal squeeze at this point. And so the front edge also showed distinct signs of erosion. There were sort of large chunks of the sarcopenia, which is that pickleweed that it's mostly made up of. In the drift line, we were out there noticing that and noticing some active erosional phases on the salt marsh. So it definitely had been shrinking over time. And then, yeah, we did a preliminary assessment of the eelgrass bed, and we actually got out there, and Nikki and Ian and some people from World Wildlife Fund were out there, and we were having a heck of a time with that eelgrass bed. It was, the upper edge wasn't all that hard to find, but gosh, the lower edge was complex, and it was defying our attempts to easy definition. So we had to sort of did that in early October, I believe, in 2021. And then Nikki and some of her staff went out later and sort of did a bit more defining of that. So I sort of put a little bit of the initial findings that we found in that first survey in the report, and then we'll hopefully add some more to that a bit later in the future. But yeah, it was definitely more complex, I think, than any of us were quite expecting when we got out there. The bathymetry out there between the beach and there's that reef out there was a little more complex than we were expecting. So, which was really neat to find. So, so yeah, that was what we found. I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone who's been living on the beach and enjoying the beach for any number of years, but I would be happy to answer any questions. I don't know if we don't do that now or save that to later, but I'm happy to answer any questions now if anyone has them.
Yeah, why don't we open that up to some quick questions directly related to the report, and
Yeah.
We'll keep recording. I think that'll be okay. Seems yeah, seems good. Does anyone have any questions? I'll scan for hands up, or if no one's jumping in, feel free.
Maybe we should just ask if anybody objects to the recording or is uncomfortable with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good question. Are there any objections to being recorded?
Don't.
Okay, yeah, we'll carry on then. And
Now, Jocelyn, I know you had posted a question that a community member had
oh, that's right.
earlier.
I can read that out here.
Community member is Mary Chu.
It's regarding
Managed to connect by telephone
Oh, good.
from the ferry in Vancouver.
This is from Mary Chu from the phone from Vancouver. Is that right, Jocelyn?
Yes.
Okay. Regarding shrinkage in the salt marsh is likely due to coastal squeeze. Are there any ways to ameliorate the shrinkage in situations like ours, where there are seawalls and no additional space?
Yeah, so you know, it's an interesting question. And of course, there's a number of different options that you can take with a restoration of a salt marsh like this. And I sort of want to make sure to point out that there's no current plan in place or anything like that, but there are some options that can be undertaken. In this case, it would seem the most logical is to reclaim some of the area that has been lost further down the beach. So we know that erosion is happening. So, you know, the prevention of that erosion and perhaps replanting out or perhaps even to the sides. So if you can't keep going backwards, there are other ways to help that salt marsh get a little bit bigger. But yeah, that would have to be something that would be considered in the future. But I think it is definitely the coastal squeeze can make it a little bit more challenging. But there's definitely ways that that can be done successfully.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Cherry has a question. He notes that in the 70s, a homeowner living on Mermaid Creek had dug a 15 by 20 meter hole for his boat in what was before the salt marsh. This hole has expanded rapidly these last 5 years. Would it be possible to restore the salt marsh in the framework of these restoration efforts in the bay?
I don't know that I can speak to that. I mean, certainly, you know, at this point, there is no fixed plan. You know, there's no developed plan for how that's going to be addressed in terms of that salt marsh restoration. Up to this point, mainly what we've looked at is the portion that is sitting right out on the beach. But, you know, there's certainly discussions that can take place in the future, but, you know, that would, a plan to go sort of further up the creek, I don't think is something we had discussed up to this point. Nikki or Ian, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I just love that question because I'm a firm believer of community-based restoration, which means that the community gives its observations and we collectively try to decide the best way to mitigate a problem. So it's a really wonderful question. I'm not aware of where that hole is, but I think that's the beginning of community-based restoration, and I think we should hold that question very close as we do travel through the funding world and get enough resources to start making a plan that the community feels comfortable with. And those kinds of problems and situations are the ones that we're really interested in. So thank you for that question.
And I'll just add, certainly with a lot of the funds that have coming through are focused on blue carbon, and the upper marsh, the values, and Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but the values of blue carbon potential that we see in the upper marsh as compared to the lower marsh are significantly higher. So it really does, from seeking funds and under the current kind of upper level directives, it makes sense to include that upper marsh area in restoration studies and plans.
Yeah, part of the challenge will be determining where the salt marsh is salt marsh, where it's brackish marsh, where it's freshwater marsh, and making sure that any of that is sort of taken into consideration as well. So there would definitely need to be a bit more surveying, because we did kind of stop at the high water line, and where the upper edge of that pickleweed marsh was. But I remember looking up the channel and thinking, gosh, there's a lot more of it back there. It was a very different character to the marsh back there, which was neat. And I think I actually do know which area you're talking about. I seem to remember from some of the imagery we're looking at thinking, oh, that's kind of an almost square shape to one of the banks back there, which of course is a little bit more unusual. But yeah, I seem to recall where that was. But yeah, I think it was a little bit further up the creek. So it was something could be taken into consideration.
Curtis asks, will another eelgrass mapping be completed in the coming weeks?
Thanks for that, Curtis. I love that there's another eelgrass person out there who's been bitten by it. And once you've been bitten, it never goes away. Yes, so this kind of segues into the funding opportunities. The funding started with the World Wildlife Fund of $71,000, and that whole purpose, as Kyle mentioned, was about blue carbon. So that included the carbon sequestered by eelgrass and the potential for restoration in that eelgrass habitat if we can figure out why there's spaces in the bed that should be continuous, and also the wetland or the marshland, as both are really efficient blue carbon sequesters if they are able to function correctly in the right size. So what we're planning is for the sea change team to go out and do this, I suspect in April or May. It's nice. February is a little early. So as you know, as the light increases, the eelgrass is more productive. So a little bit later in the spring is a better time to do the survey to complete it. And we'll finish that. And as we're doing a polygon, which is looking at the whole area transects from the outer edge to the inner edge, we'll be able to identify a little bit more about why are there spaces in there, and is that a natural space because of a current or a channel going out there, or is that damage from something that we could say has been removed, or is that a continual damage that is not worth restoring because it's just going to be destroyed again? Long answer to a great question. Thanks.
We have a question from Peter Wainwright. How much would it cost to develop a restoration plan? I guess I'll take a stab at this one. There's a couple of moving pieces. So there's still some study that needs to happen, as well as depending on what ecosystem we're targeting. So overall, a coastal dynamics study needs to be initiated, which would look at some of these sedimentary processes in the bay that could, illuminate some of the underlying mechanisms to eelgrass decline, as well as how these sediments are moving down and across the beach. So that is one kind of study and price tag that needs to be addressed. There is an investigation to the erosion of the upper marsh, i.e. kind of Mermaid Creek. So that is, before any kind of work can be done in there, there would need to be a study that really illuminates some of those mechanisms and processes, and put together a plan to address them. And then the marsh, the lower marsh, so that's a Saracornia kind of area that was, you know, really highlighted in Sarah's report quite well, how that's been lost. So there's a couple of different moving pieces and a couple of different price tags attached to them. So we are kind of trying to address them as we can with fundraising. Dollar values, it depends. It depends how much and how much study we put into it before, who does the study, and then how much we actually tackle. In a place like Roberts Bay, it seems like pilot studies and pilot projects are probably going to be the way to go, because it is such a large and dynamic study, and to structure these in such a way that they work to give us more answers as we unfold them. So something like a pilot nourishment study, where we're, you know, being very strategic in where we put small amounts of nourishment on the back shore, with a very smart monitoring plan that shows us how these sediments move throughout the bay, is a great first step. Focusing in on the salt marsh, looking at different forms of wave attenuation, nourishment, and kind of promoting, as Sarah described, that kind of seaward expansion in response to that coastal squeeze, would be another kind of chewable piece. And then at the same time, looking at that upper marsh around Mermaid Creek, finding more understanding about what the dynamics and the mechanisms are for its erosion, as well as, you know, developing some strategies to mitigate it. I haven't mentioned any dollar values. I'm not sure I have those directly on hand, but I think we can speak more to that in the future. Anything to add to that? I'm wondering if Ian's looking in his microscope. Yeah, and the eelgrass, Nikki, you know, looking at the eelgrass again, before too much investment goes in, looking at the underlying causes and mechanisms for its erosion and disappearance. And you know, we're so lucky to have Nikki and her team here with that capacity to do that work once those mechanisms have been identified and are understood a little more clearly. I hope that answers that question. Curtis,
so ballpark figures, it's hard to answer because we've been looking at funding opportunities, and so Pacific Salmon Foundation has given 30,000, 35?
27.
27,000, okay. And then World Wildlife gave 71, about 40,000 is left from that. We applied to the Environment and Climate Change grant. I don't remember the ballpark figure for that, Kyle.
It's a big one, but
It's a big one for over a few years.
Over a few years. And it all kind of requires matching funds. So right now we're at the piece where we're kind of taking these smaller pieces, trying to secure funding for these smaller pieces, but then using them to leverage to get a larger securement to be able to do some of these larger studies that will inform kind of a larger restoration plan. So that's the strategy as it stands now. Curtis asks, can Ardwell Beach be classed not as a relic delta? It is active wave dominated delta with storm rainflow washing the wave created beach back out with every rain, very low sediment source. Sarah?
Yes, you bet. You're quite right, Curtis, that it is a very active area, and we certainly noticed that. When we were using the term relic, we were more meaning that there's no longer continuous water flow like into that particular part of the beach. But we did notice that it's got some very dynamic berms on it, and it's pretty clear the sediment moves a lot. So the term relic, I can see why that might have caused a little bit of confusion, but in this term, we're only meaning that there's no longer an active stream or river flowing into that but it appears to have the same form as a delta. So we're kind of assuming at one point that's what had happened, and that the forces on the beach are maintaining that general shape of a delta. But it's definitely clear, you're right, that sediment does move around a lot in that area. And I imagine if there is a large storm event, that storm drain does create quite a cut through the berm in there. Yeah. I haven't been down there when it's been a big outflow, but no. So yeah, the term relic in this case is more referring to the source as opposed to the actual form itself.
Thanks, Sarah. Jocelyn, I'm not sure if you're passing this question through, but around the bay, seawalls are not going away anytime. Oh, sorry, is that an old one? Oh, that was the first question. Oh no, that's right. Around the bay, seawalls are not going away anytime soon. Can you say any more about what can be done to enhance the beach under these circumstances? Thinking of the north side.
Well, I think that there are lots of examples, in other places of what has been done, to work with the current conditions on the beach, because, you can't turn back the clock. You can't, change what is at this point. But I still think there's, I don't know, and Nikki and Kyle and Ian, you can chime in on these ones, but it seems like there's lots that can be done working with the existing conditions on the beach to help enhance what's there and help to make sure that more isn't lost. So, I still think there's a lot, if we just put the appropriate plan together, I don't think that would be any kind of barrier to success, but you guys can certainly, of course, chime in if I'm.
Yeah, and again, I think that comes with the pilot nourishment study. So picking small strategic locations, providing some nourishment to those backshore areas, and with a really comprehensive monitoring plan, watch how those sediments move throughout the bay. I think that is a really good first step, is to kind of understand what's happening there, and can be done without touching any seawalls. Is it addressing systemic issues? We don't know. So it is kind of a band-aid solution, but one that would benefit nature and provide some resilience moving forward. Jocelyn, what habitats are we prioritizing? Why are they important? Ooh.
I wouldn't call it prioritizing habitats. I think the overall goal is increase the species diversity and abundance, and the short term for that is biodiversity. And it's really, really important for us to just remember how integrated the whole system is, from the backshore to the foreshore, to the intertidal, to the eelgrass beds and beyond. It's all one system. So prioritization is not a word I like to use. I think when we prioritize, it's just what resources do we have to attack this big problem about losing biodiversity, but it's not prioritizing which species or which habitat is more important than another, because they all interplay and intersect and involve so many synergies that quite possibly the best ecologist doesn't even understand. We're still trying to understand the interconnectedness of how nature works. And the ocean, especially this beach, I get very excited about because it is so dynamic, but it also has so much potential, and it has so much history of biodiversity, and it has so much community investment. People care about this place, but it's also extremely vulnerable to climate changes, to the storm events that are becoming more and more severe, to sea level rise. So when Kyle said it's a Band-Aid solution, any solution we come up with, any restoration method that is seen as feasible on this beach, has to be seen as a time-limited solution. The sea is coming and it's not to be stopped. So I don't want to be doom and gloom, but we do have to be realistic about what we are facing and what the future holds. So we're trying to work with the natural processes, but those processes are changing right before our eyes. Every winter is getting more and more severe, and the ocean is getting closer and closer into the land. So as long as we can understand those dynamics and not put ourselves in the illusion that any fix is going to be permanent, then I think we're in a good place of understanding.
I would just add, maybe if that word prioritize came out of in my vernacular, it's simply due to kind of working in a nonprofit, where those funds are coming from, and what the directive of those funds are. So a lot of times when we are applying for these fundings, they have specific mandates that we have to kind of mold our projects to. If we had all the money in the world, we'd look at Roberts Bay as a whole system, and we would restore the bay looking at that as a full system. But that's not the way that funding works, unfortunately. So prioritize / kind of, we have to shape our efforts to be in line with where the money's coming from to ensure that Roberts Bay gets the attention that it deserves. And to do this in a way that is smart enough so that as we're looking at certain habitats, we're gaining information on how to restore the bay as a whole.
Yeah, and some habitats definitely do get more attention than others. And, for example, we're talking a lot about the salt marsh and a lot about the eelgrass. And that is because they stand in as really good proxies, biologically speaking, for that biodiversity. So they're some of those foundational ecosystems that really affect, a large number of other creatures, the birds and the invertebrates that they eat and everything like that. So it's a way that we can sort of focus efforts on some areas where we feel like, at least from restoration projects that I've been involved in, I feel like you can make the biggest impact. So best bang for your buck, basically.
Just scanning the chat for any more questions. And I feel like we've answered a lot of kind of what we had to say about funding anyway through this Q&A. Nikki, do you feel like there's anything to add?
No, unless there's any questions from the audience, we can move on from that. One of the questions we wanted to ask you, to switch off from the money issue, is to ask you how you would like to hear from us as the funding, I'll be optimistic, as the funding flows in and things start to unfold as far as planning goes, and speculation of the next steps. How would you like for us to communicate with you? Would you like to do site visits in the spring? If in-person community meetings are allowed after the 15th of February, would you like to have a larger meeting if you all feel safe with that? Or do you want to continue with a Zoom on a regular basis? I'd love to hear from all of you on that one, because that's what community-based restoration is all about, is good communications. Any thoughts about that?
I will say that my sense is that what's perhaps most effective, and there really aren't very many, there aren't very many people here who actually live on Roberts Bay, as far as I know. So I think my sense is that face to face in person, and probably on the beach. I'm thinking of the people who come to Friends of Shoal Harbor's annual Bufflehead celebration. And the people who, if people see something happening on the beach, I mean, we could certainly tell them that in advance that it's going to happen, but if they, somehow I think people feel more comfortable and more engaged in that kind of setting as per Sarah's experience. I don't know what Curtis or Thierry, or I don't know, Mary may have a bad connection. Anyone else?
Well, for myself, I like in-person things, but I'm a bad person to ask, Nikki, because I mean, it'd be good to see you down there every time that I'm down there, which is almost every day, which I'm not expecting. So, but having a feedback mechanism, like, you know, when I see the storm outfall, the rainwater from the street or the snow melt back in January, eroding a channel 1.5 to 1.8 meters deep through the old beach berm, it would be good to say, hey, this is what's happening, but we don't have a place to mention that right now, other than I call Jocelyn. Thanks.
So pictures say 1,000 words, right? When you see those kinds of changes, you could, we'll figure that out, but the pictures mean a lot. It's sort of a citizen science at its best.
Right.
Noticing erosion, noticing the effects of stormwater, eelgrass loss at low tide. It's really, really helpful. It informs our restoration, but it also just tells us what kind of changes are going on with climate changes and huge volumes of water going through the system.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we can also take pictures of when a whole bunch of styrofoam chips
That's
wash
right.
into the bay and then they wash out again, you know.
That's right.
What we can do is work with Jocelyn and the RBR and create a shared Dropbox or Google Drive where residents can submit these, because those would be fantastic.
Yeah,
Just
with the date and the place and
and
what it
something,
is.
yeah, and if you can put
Yeah.
something in there for scale, if it's a photo or a video, if you have.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, like a hand or a dime or something, so we get a sense of what we're looking at. I think that's a great idea.
I wish I could take credit for it. It's a direct message from Ian Bruce in the chat, but
Yeah, it's a great
thank you,
thing.
Ian.
I'm wanting to ask Peter, is this something that the town would have an interest in? You know, should we be notifying the town, or is this something really outside current scope? Or the kind of thing like erosion or something on the beach? I know I have a good experience with the town very quickly coming to remove, or getting a contractor to remove creosote logs that are leaching onto the beach, but sort of a new channel or something.
That it's a difficult one for me to answer. Town is quick to respond to a physical problem like a derelict boat washed up on the beach, or somebody having deposited something that's not supposed to be there, you know, drywall, debris, whatever. But if there is something that looks like a natural event, like a channel cut by a storm, or strong storm drain discharge, something like that, I'm not sure. Well, our public works staff don't have the expertise to be able to go to the site and evaluate, is this a natural occurrence? Is something I should be doing something about? And also the what should I be doing about it? And certainly don't have the capacity to take a large volume of, I'm going to say, anecdotal or even quantitative measurements and analyze them and put them together. Like, that's not within the expertise of our staff. So reporting that kind of stuff to the town is likely not to like, unless it's one of those instances of a derelict boat or something that we obviously should be dealing with, reporting something to the town, I think often winds up being frustrating for a resident because nothing really comes of it.
Thank
What
you.
about construction issues that are what some of us might think were possibly not legal, but are happening? And a lot of people seem to want to ask forgiveness rather than get permits to do things properly.
Yeah, so that's a different thing. So like bylaw enforcement is something we do. So if somebody's doing an activity that requires a permit or an approval that they don't have, then bylaw enforcement does respond. And we respond as soon as we become aware. So if somebody complains, we look into it. And we always do. So that kind of thing, if you've got a concern, definitely, that's something, get hold of our bylaw enforcement and they'll look into it.
You know, and this maybe hopefully isn't too much of a different path, but we work with a lot of coastal communities, and there was at one point we had sort of developed this app called Beach Observer, which was just allowing people walking on the beach to take a photo of something they observed, put in a comment, tag it. It automatically geotagged it and posted it to a website that actually allowed people to just collect anything. And it wasn't specific to any one particular, it could have been marine debris, it could have been some change in sediment, it could have been a species. It never ended up it kind of ended up lapsing a little bit over time because we never had a specific project for it. But it was something I always thought was really interesting, how many people really wanted to be able to, on their morning walks, just be able to say, I want to tell someone what I'm seeing, and I want to share it with other people who are interested in what I'm seeing because I see something different, or I see something unusual, or I see something I see every day, but I want to make a record of it. So, you know, it is kind of an interesting, and there are other ways, like, you know, a shared Dropbox or Google Drive that has specific comments attached to a particular image. I would maybe just say that the geotagging is a fairly important component of that. So in order to be able to place that observation in a particular time in a particular spot. But yeah, I always thought it was really interesting how much the places we love to document them. And I think it's just wonderful when we can find an opportunity to do that.
And if we're thinking of future restoration activities, it could be used for and sort of aggregated, put together in a way that becomes meaningful overall, like your own report, frankly.
Sarah, the RBC Tech for Nature grant just closed, but I think we should talk for next year. Get
Yeah,
that
you know,
app going again.
We had so much fun making it. We had so much fun testing it, and it just we never quite found the right project to attach it to, unfortunately. But we still have it. It's still sitting there. It's just
Cool.
kind of lapsing at the moment. But yeah, it would be great to discuss it, because I feel like, especially if we could really engage a particular community, it would be a neat way to almost create our own story map, which is something I just love working with in ArcGIS. It's a way to really record the story of a particular place. So yeah, but that'd be great.
Yeah, let's chat more about that. That sounds great. Sarah Duncan's left, but Peter, thanks for coming and for answering those questions related to the city or the town. I also want to just give props to Sarah Duncan for some really quick turnarounds on some letters of support for us in granting so far. I think that should be recognized, that she's been a wonderful liaison for us and to council, and would like to thank her for her efforts there. Super helpful. We're at 7:30. Ian, sorry, go ahead.
So I just want to jump in. Great evening, thanks. I think you did really well, Sarah, Dicky, Kyle, everybody else explaining what's where we're at, and I concur 100% with what everyone said. I just want to put a little ad out. we do the forage fish monitoring on the beaches around here. We're a part of a really exciting initiative where we've just formed the BC Forage Fish Monitoring Network with about altogether a couple 300 stewards around the Sailor Sea and out to the West Coast that are actively monitoring for forage fish on beaches, as well as some herring and some other things too. So that's kind of a new initiative that we're heading up. And so the people that are working on the beaches, you're part of something bigger now. And yeah, so just check in later for that. Just want to give a little commercial for that.
Well, we do notice the changes too from time to time, and especially when the beaches were at quite a lot. So we record those every time we are out there looking.
Well, that's great. I'm just looking at the chat for any last questions. Thank you, Sandra. And thank you, Sandra, for your hundreds of hours of volunteer work looking for forage fish eggs. All-star. I guess that concludes this evening. Thank you all for coming.
Somebody got a hand up?
Do we have a hand up? Go ahead.
Terry?
Is someone still muted? Have I muted you, Terry?
Yeah,
Oh, there you are.
I just wonder if it would be interesting to have, but we need a good spot for that, to have a camera which just take picture regularly from a certain place, if that could be useful. And I don't know if one of the people who are living around the bay, would be agreed to support. I can do that from where I'm living. I'm living just near Mermaid Creek, and I take regularly picture of Mermaid Creek when it's very high tide, and that's probably one of the photo that will be useful. But if there is any place when that would be useful to have, regularly photo of what's happening during a year, I mean, that's maybe something that we can explore, and I think it would be a interesting project. That somebody can do that voluntary. We just need to see what would be the best spot to do that, and with your help, and then we'll really see what's happening during the year.
That's a great idea. I really like that idea. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Sarah, for making time and presenting those results. Thank you, Nikki, and for everyone.
Kyle.
And yeah, we'll see you all soon. We're always here. If you'd like to get in touch with us, come to our websites, peninsulastreams.ca. Nikki, do you want to put your website in the chat?
Sure.
And you can always get in touch with us through there or reach out personally. And thanks so much, everyone.
You.
Thank you.